The Cousins by Herman Melville. Chapter 1. Though resolved to face all out to the last, at whatever desperate hazard, Pierre had not started for the city without some reasonable plans, both with reference to his more immediate circumstances and his ulterior condition. There resided in the city a cousin of his, Glendinning Stanley, better known in the general family as Glen Stanley, and by Pierre as Cousin Glen. Like Pierre, he was an only son. His parents had died in his early childhood, and within the present year he had returned from a protracted sojourn in Europe to enter, at the age of 21, into the untrammeled possession of a noble property, which in the hands of faithful guardians had largely accumulated. In their boyhood and earlier adolescence, Pierre and Glen had cherished a much more than cousinly attachment. At the age of 10, they had furnished an example of the truth that the friendship of fine-hearted, generous boys, nurtured amid the romance-engendering comforts and elegancies of life, sometimes transcends the bounds of mere boyishness, and revels for a while in the empyrean of a love which only comes short, by one degree, of the sweetest sentiment entertained between the sexes. Nor is this boy-love without the occasional fillips and spicinesses, which at times, by an apparent abatement, enhance the permanent delights of those more advanced lovers who love beneath the cestus of Venus. Jealousies are felt. The sight of another lad too much consorting with the boy's beloved object shall fill him with emotions akin to those of Othello's. A fancied slight or lessening of the everyday indications of warm feelings shall prompt him to bitter upbraidings and reproaches, or shall plunge him into evil moods, for which grim solitude only is congenial. Nor are the letters of Aphroditean devotees more charged with headlong vows and protestations, more cross-written and crammed with discursive sentimentalities, more undeviating in their semi-weekliness or dailiness, as the case may be, than are the love-friendship missives of boys. Among those bundles of papers which Pierre, in an ill hour, so frantically destroyed in the chamber of the inn, were 2 large packages of letters, densely written, and in many cases inscribed crosswise throughout with red ink upon black, so that the love in those letters was 2 layers deep, and 1 pen and 1 pigment were insufficient to paint it. The first package contained the letters of Glen to Pierre, the other those of Pierre to Glen, which, just prior to Glen's departure for Europe, Pierre had obtained from him, in order to reread them in his absence, and so fortify himself the more in his affection, by reviving reference to the young, ardent hours of its earliest manifestations. But as the advancing fruit itself extrudes the beautiful blossom, so in many cases does the eventual love for the other sex forever dismiss the preliminary love-friendship of boys. The mere outer friendship may in some degree, greater or less, survive, but the singular love in it has perishingly dropped away. If in the eye of unyielding reality and truth, the earthly heart of man do indeed ever fix upon some one woman, to whom alone, thenceforth eternally to be a devotee, without a single shadow of the misgiving of its faith, and who, to him, does perfectly embody his finest, loftiest dream of feminine loveliness, if this indeed be so, and may heaven grant that it be nevertheless, in metropolitan cases, the love of the most single-eyed lover, almost invariably, is nothing more than the ultimate settling of innumerable wandering glances upon some one specific object, as admonished that the wonderful scope and variety of female loveliness, if too long suffered to sway us without decision, shall finally confound all power of selection. The confirmed bachelor is, in America at least, quite as often the victim of a too profound appreciation of the infinite charmingness of woman, as made solitary for life by the legitimate empire of a cold and tasteless temperament. Though the peculiar heart-longings pertaining to his age had at last found their glowing response in the bosom of Lucy, yet for some period prior to that, Pierre had not been insensible to the miscellaneous promptings of the passion, so that even before he became a declarative lover, love had yet made him her general votary, and so already there had gradually come a cooling over that ardent sentiment which in earlier years he had cherished for Glen. All round and round does the world lie as in a sharpshooter's ambush, to pick off the beautiful illusions of youth, by the pitiless cracking rifles of the realities of the age. If the general love for women had in Pierre sensibly modified his particular sentiment toward Glen, neither had the 1,000 nameless fascinations of the then brilliant paradises of France and Italy failed to exert their seductive influence on many of the previous feelings of Glen. For as the very best advantages of life are not without some envious drawback, so it is among the evils of enlarged foreign travel, that in young and unsolid minds, it dislodges some of the finest feelings of the home-born nature, replacing them with a fastidious superciliousness, which like the all-edged bigoted federalism of old times would not, according to a political legend, grind its daily coffee in any mill save of European manufacture, and was satirically said to have thought of importing European air for domestic consumption. The mutually curtailed, lessening, long postponed, and at last altogether ceasing letters of Pierre and Glen were the melancholy attestations of a fact, which perhaps neither of them took very severely to heart, as certainly, concerning it, neither took the other to task. In the earlier periods of that strange transition from the generous impulsiveness of youth to the provident circumspectness of age, there generally intervenes a brief pause of unpleasant reconsidering, when finding itself all wide of its former spontaneous self, the soul hesitates to commit itself wholly to selfishness, more than repents its wanderings. Yet all this is but transient, and again hurried on by the swift current of life. The prompt-hearted boy scarce longer is to be recognized in matured man, very slow to feel, deliberate even in love, and statistical even in piety. During the sway of this peculiar period, the boy shall still make some strenuous efforts to retrieve his departing spontaneities. But so alloyed are all such endeavors with the incipiencies of selfishness that they were best not made at all, since too often they seem but empty and self-deceptive sallies, or still worse, the merest hypocritical assumptions. Upon the return of Glen from abroad, the commonest courtesy, not to say the blood relation between them, prompted Pierre to welcome him home, with a letter, which though not overlong and little enthusiastic, still breathed a spirit of cousinly consideration and kindness, pervadingly touched by the then naturally frank and all-attractive spirit of Pierre. To this, the less earnest and now Europeanized Glen had replied in a letter all sudden suavity, and in a strain of artistic artlessness, mourned the apparent decline of their friendship, yet fondly trusted that now, notwithstanding their long separation, it would revive with added sincerity. Yet upon accidentally fixing his glance upon the opening salutation of this delicate missive, Pierre thought he perceived certain, not wholly disguisable chirographic tokens, that the "My very dear Pierre," with which the letter seemed to have been begun, had originally been written "Dear Pierre," but that when all was concluded, and Glen's signature put to it, then the ardent words "My very" had been prefixed to the reconsidered "Dear Pierre," a casual supposition which possibly, however, unfounded, materially retarded any answering warmth in Pierre, lest his generous flame should only embrace a flaunted feather. Nor was this idea altogether unreinforced, when on the reception of a second, and now half-business letter, of which mixed sort nearly all the subsequent ones were, from Glen, he found that the "My very dear Pierre" had already retreated into "My dear Pierre," and on a third occasion into "Dear Pierre," and on a fourth had made a forced and very spirited advanced march up to "My dearest Pierre," all of which fluctuations augured ill for the determinateness of that love, which, however immensely devoted to one cause, could yet hoist and sail under the flags of all nations. Nor could he but now applaud a still subsequent letter from Glen, which abruptly, and almost with apparent indecorousness, under the circumstances, commenced the strain of friendship without any overture of salutation whatever. As if at last, owing to its infinite delicateness, entirely hopeless of precisely defining the nature of their mystical love, Glen chose rather to leave that precise definition to the sympathetical heart and imagination of Pierre, while he himself would go on to celebrate the general relation by many a sugared sentence of miscellaneous devotion. It was a little curious and rather sardonically diverting to compare these masterly, yet not wholly successful and indeterminate tactics of the accomplished Glen, with the unfaltering stream of beloved Pierre's, which not only flowed along the top margin of all his earlier letters, but here and there, from their subterranean channel, flashed out in bright intervals, through all the succeeding lines. Nor had the chance recollection of these things at all restrained the reckless hand of Pierre, when he threw the whole package of letters, both new and old, into that most honest and summary of all elements, which is neither a respecter of persons, nor a finical critic of what manner of writings it burns, but like ultimate truth itself, of which it is the eloquent symbol, consumes all and only consumes. When the betrothment of Pierre to Lucy had become an acknowledged thing, the courtly Glen, besides the customary felicitations upon that event, had not omitted so fit an opportunity to retender to his cousin all his previous jars of honey and treacle, accompanied by additional boxes of candied citron and plums. Pierre thanked him kindly, but in certain little roguish ambiguities begged leave on the ground of cloying, to return him enclosed by far the greater portion of his present, whose non-substantialness was allegorically typified in the containing letter itself, prepaid with only the usual postage. True love, as everyone knows, will still withstand many repulses, even though rude. But whether it was the love or the politeness of Glen, which on this occasion proved invincible, is a matter we will not discuss. Certain it was, that quite undaunted, Glen nobly returned to the charge, and in a very prompt and unexpected answer, extended to Pierre all the courtesies of the general city, and all the hospitalities of 5 sumptuous chambers, which he and his luxurious environments contrived nominally to occupy in the most fashionable private hotel of a very opulent town. Nor did Glen rest here, but like Napoleon, now seemed bent upon gaining the battle by throwing all his regiments upon one point of attack, and gaining that point at all hazards. Hearing of some rumor at the tables of his relatives that the day was being fixed for the positive nuptials of Pierre, Glen called all his Parisian portfolios for his rosiest sheet, and with scented ink and a pen of gold, indited a most burnished and redolent letter, which, after invoking all the blessings of Apollo and Venus, and the 9 muses, and the cardinal virtues upon the coming event, concluded at last with a really magnificent testimonial to his love. According to this letter, among his other real estate in the city, Glen had inherited a very charming little old house, completely furnished in the style of the last century, in a quarter of the city which, though now not so garishly fashionable as of yore, still in its quiet secludedness, possessed great attractions for the retired billings and cooings of a honeymoon. Indeed, he begged leave now to christen it the Courie, and if after his wedding jaunt, Pierre would deign to visit the city with his bride for a month or 2 sojourn, then the Courie would be but too happy in affording him a harbor. His sweet cousin need be under no apprehension. Owing to the absence of any fit applicant for it, the house had now long been without a tenant, save an old, confidential bachelor clerk of his father's, who on a nominal rent, and more by way of safekeeping to the house than anything else, was now hanging up his well-furbished hat in its hall. This accommodating old clerk would quickly unpeg his beaver at the first hint of new occupants. Glen would charge himself with supplying the house in advance with a proper retinue of servants. Fires would be made in the long unoccupied chambers. The venerable, grotesque, old mahoganies and marbles and mirror frames and moldings could be very soon dusted and burnished. The kitchen was amply provided with the necessary utensils for cooking. The strong box of old silver immemorially pertaining to the mansion could be readily carted round from the vaults of the neighboring bank, while the hampers of old china, still retained in the house, needed but little trouble to unpack, so that silver and china would soon stand assorted in their appropriate closets. At the turning of a faucet in the cellar, the best of the city's water would not fail to contribute its ingredient to the concocting of a welcoming glass of negus before retiring on the first night of their arrival. The over-fastidiousness of some unhealthily critical minds, as well as the moral pusillanimity of others, equally bars the acceptance of effectually substantial favors from persons whose motive in proffering them is not altogether clear and unimpeachable, and toward whom, perhaps, some prior coolness or indifference has been shown. But when the acceptance of such a favor would be really convenient and desirable to the one party, and completely unattended with any serious distress to the other, there would seem to be no sensible objection to an immediate embrace of the offer. And when the acceptor is in rank and fortune the general equal of the profferer, and perhaps his superior, so that any courtesy he receives can be amply returned in the natural course of future events, then all motives to decline are very materially lessened. And as for the 1,000 inconceivable finicalnesses of small pros and cons about imaginary fitnesses, and proprieties, and self-consistencies, thank heaven, in the hour of heart health, none such shilly-shollying sail-trimmers ever balk the onward course of a bluff-minded man. He takes the world as it is, and carelessly accommodates himself to its whimsical humors, nor ever feels any compunction at receiving the greatest possible favors from those who are as able to grant, as free to bestow. He himself bestows upon occasion, so that, at bottom, common charity steps in to dictate a favorable consideration for all possible profferings, seeing that the acceptance shall only the more enrich him, indirectly, for new and larger beneficences of his own. And as for those who no ways pretend with themselves to regulate their deportment by considerations of genuine benevolence, and to whom such courteous profferings hypocritically come from persons whom they suspect for secret enemies, Then to such minds not only will their own worldly tactics at once forbid the uncivil blank repulse of such offers, but if they are secretly malicious as well as frigid, or if they are at all capable of being fully gratified by the sense of concealed superiority and mastership which precious few men are, then how delightful for such persons under the guise of mere acquiescence in his own voluntary civilities, to make genteel use of their foe. For one would like to know what were foes made for except to be used. In the rude ages men hunted and javelined the tiger, because they hated him for a mischief-minded wild beast. But in these enlightened times, though we love the tiger as little as ever, still we mostly hunt him for the sake of his skin. A wise man then will wear his tiger. Every morning put on his tiger for a robe to keep him warm and adorn him. In this view, foes are far more desirable than friends. For who would hunt and kill his own faithful affectionate dog for the sake of his skin? And is a dog's skin as valuable as a tiger's? Cases there are where it becomes soberly advisable, by direct arts to convert some well-wishers into foes. It is false that, in point of policy, a man should never make enemies. As well-wishers some men may not only be nugatory but positive obstacles in your peculiar plans, but as foes you may subordinately cement them into your general design. But into these ulterior refinements of cool Tuscan policy, Pierre as yet had never become initiated. His experiences hitherto not having been varied and ripe enough for that. Besides, he had altogether too much generous blood in his heart. Nevertheless, thereafter, in a less immature hour, though still he shall not have the heart to practice upon such maxims as the above, yet shall he have the brain thoroughly to comprehend their practicability, which is not always the case. And generally, in worldly wisdom, men will deny to one the possession of all insight, which one does not by his everyday outward life practically reveal. It is a very common error of some unscrupulously infidel-minded, selfish, unprincipled, or downright knavish men, to suppose that believing men or benevolent-hearted men or good men do not know enough to be unscrupulously selfish, do not know enough to be unscrupulous knaves. And thus, thanks to the world, are there many spies in the world's camp, who are mistaken for strolling simpletons. And these strolling simpletons seem to act upon the principle that in certain things we do not so much learn, by showing that already we know a vast deal, as by negatively seeming rather ignorant. But here we press upon the frontiers of that sort of wisdom, which it is very well to possess, but not sagacious to show that you possess. Still, men there are, who having quite done with the world, all its mere worldly contents are become so far indifferent, that they care little of what mere worldly imprudence they may be guilty. Now, if it were not conscious considerations like the really benevolent or neutral ones first mentioned above, it was certainly something akin to them, which had induced Pierre to return a straightforward, manly, and entire acceptance to his cousin of the offer of the house, thanking him over and over for his most supererogatory kindness concerning the pre-engagement of servants and so forth, and the setting in order of the silver and china, but reminding him, nevertheless, that he had overlooked all special mention of wines, and begged him to store the bins with a few of the very best brands. He would likewise be obliged, if he would personally purchase at a certain celebrated grocer's a small bag of undoubted mocha coffee, but Glen need not order it to be roasted or ground, because Pierre preferred that both those highly important and flavor-deciding operations should be performed instantaneously previous to the final boiling and serving. Nor did he say that he would pay for the wines and the mocha. He contented himself with merely stating the remissness on the part of his cousin, and pointing out the best way of remedying it. He concluded his letter by intimating that though the rumor of a set day, and a near one, for his nuptials was unhappily but ill-founded, yet he would not hold Glen's generous offer as merely based upon that presumption, and consequently falling with it, but on the contrary would consider it entirely good for whatever time it might prove available to Pierre. He was betrothed beyond a peradventure, and hoped to be married ere death. Meanwhile, Glen would further oblige him by giving the confidential clerk a standing notice to quit. Though at first quite amazed at this letter, for indeed, his offer might possibly have proceeded as much from ostentation as anything else, nor had he dreamed of so unhesitating an acceptance. Pierre's cousin was too much of a precocious young man of the world, disclosedly to take it in any other than a very friendly, and cousinly, and humorous, and yet practical way, which he plainly evinced by a reply far more sincere and every way creditable, apparently, both to his heart and head, than any. letter he had written to Pierre since the days of their boyhood. And thus, by the bluffness and, in some sort, uncompunctuousness of Pierre, this very artificial youth was well betrayed into an act of effective kindness, being forced now to drop the empty mask of ostentation and put on the solid, hearty features of a genuine face. And just so are some people in the world to be joked into occasional effective goodness, when all coyness and coolness, all resentments, and all solemn preaching would fail. Chapter 2. But little would we comprehend the peculiar relation between Pierre and Glen, a relation involving in the end the most serious results, were there not here thrown over the whole equivocal, preceding account of it, another and more comprehensive equivocalness, which shall absorb all minor ones in itself, and so make one pervading ambiguity the only possible explanation for all the ambiguous details. It had long been imagined by Pierre that prior to his own special devotion to Lucy, the splendid Glen had not been entirely insensible to her surprising charms. Yet this conceit in its incipiency he knew not how to account for. Assuredly his cousin had never in the slightest conceivable hint betrayed it. And as for Lucy, the same intuitive delicacy which forever forbade Pierre to question her on the subject, did equally close her own voluntary lips. Between Pierre and Lucy, delicateness put her sacred signet on this chest of secrecy, which like the wax of an executor upon a desk, though capable of being melted into nothing by the smallest candle, for all this, still possesses to the reverent the prohibitive virtue of inexorable bars and bolts. If Pierre superficially considered the deportment of Glen toward him, therein he could find no possible warrant for indulging the suspicious idea. Doth jealousy smile so benignantly and offer its house to the bride? Still, on the other hand, to quit the mere surface of the deportment of Glen, and penetrate beneath its brocaded vesture, there Pierre sometimes seemed to see the long-lurking and yet unhealed wound of all a rejected lover's most rankling detestation of a supplanting rival, only intensified by their former friendship and the unimpairable blood relation between them. Now, viewed by the light of this master solution, all the singular enigmas in Glen, his capriciousness in the matter of the epistolary, dear Pierre's and dearest Pierre's, the mercurial fall from the fever heat of cordiality to below the zero of indifference, then the contrary rise to fever heat, and, above all, his emphatic redundancy of devotion so soon as the positive espousals of Pierre seemed on the point of consummation. Thus read, all these riddles apparently found their cunning solution. For the deeper that some men feel a secret and poignant feeling, the higher they pile the belying surfaces. The friendly deportment of Glen then was to be considered as in direct proportion to his hoarded hate, and the climax of that hate was evinced in throwing open his house to the bride. Yet if hate was the abstract cause, hate could not be the immediate motive of the conduct of Glen. Is hate so hospitable? The immediate motive of Glen then must be the intense desire to disguise from the wide world, a fact unspeakably humiliating to his gold-laced and haughty soul, the fact that in the profoundest desire of his heart, Pierre had so victoriously supplanted him. Yet was it that very artful deportment in Glen, which Glen profoundly assumed to this grand end, that consummately artful deportment it was, which first obtruded upon Pierre the surmise, which by that identical method his cousin was so absorbedly intent upon rendering impossible to him. Hence we here see that as in the negative way the secrecy of any strong emotion is exceedingly difficult to be kept lastingly private to one's own bosom by any human being, so it is one of the most fruitless undertakings in the world, to attempt by affirmative assumptions to tender to men the precisely opposite emotion as yours. Therefore the final wisdom decrees, that if you have aught which you desire to keep a secret to yourself, be a quietist there, and do and say nothing at all about it. For among all the poor chances this is the least poor. Pretensions and substitutions are only the recourse of undergraduates in the science of the world, in which science, on his own ground, my Lord Chesterfield, is the poorest possible preceptor. The earliest instinct of the child, and the ripest experience of age, unite in affirming simplicity to be the truest and profoundest part for man. Likewise the simplicity is so universal and all-containing as a rule for human life, that the subtlest bad man, and the purest good man, as well as the profoundest wise man, do all alike present it on that side which they socially turn to the inquisitive and unscrupulous world. Chapter 3. Now the matter of the house had remained in precisely the above-stated awaiting predicament, down to the time of Pierre's great life revolution, the receipt of Isabelle's letter. And though, indeed, Pierre could not but naturally hesitate at still accepting the use of the dwelling, under the widely different circumstances in which he now found himself, and though at first the strongest possible spontaneous objections on the ground of personal independence, pride, and general scorn, all clamorously declared in his breast against such a course, yet finally the same uncompunctuous, ever-adaptive sort of motive which had induced his original acceptation, prompted him, in the end, still to maintain it unrevoked. It would at once set him at rest from all immediate tribulations of mere bed and board, and by affording him a shelter for an indefinite term, enable him the better to look about him, and consider what could best be done to further the permanent comfort of those whom fate had entrusted to his charge. Irrespective, it would seem, of that wide general awaking of his profounder being, consequent upon the extraordinary trials he had so aggregatively encountered of late, the thought was indignantly suggested to him that the world must indeed be organically despicable, if it held that an offer superfluously accepted in the hour of his abundance should now be rejected in that of his utmost need. And without at all imputing any singularity of benevolent-mindedness to his cousin, he did not for a moment question that under the changed aspect of affairs, Glen would at least pretend the more eagerly to welcome him to the house, now that the mere thing of apparent courtesy had become transformed into something like a thing of positive and urgent necessity. When Pierre also considered that not himself only was concerned, but likewise two peculiarly helpless fellow beings, one of them bound to him from the first by the most sacred ties, and lately inspiring an emotion which passed all human precedent in its mixed and mystical import. These added considerations completely overthrew in Pierre all remaining dictates of his vague pride and false independence, if such indeed had ever been his. Though the interval elapsing between his decision to depart with his companions for the city, and his actual start in the coach, had not enabled him to receive any replying word from his cousin, and though Pierre knew better than to expect it, yet a preparative letter to him he had sent, and did not doubt that this proceeding would prove well advised in the end. In naturally strong-minded men, however young and inexperienced in some things, those great and sudden emergencies, which but confound the timid and the weak, only serve to call forth all their generous latentness, and teach them, as by inspiration, extraordinary maxims of conduct, whose counterpart, in other men, is only the result of a long, variously tried and painstaking life. One of those maxims is that when, through whatever cause, we are suddenly translated from opulence to need, or from a fair fame to a foul, and straightway it becomes necessary not to contradict the thing, so far at least as the mere imputation goes, to someone previously entertaining high conventional regard for us, and from whom we would now solicit some genuine helping offices. Then, all explanation or palliation should be scorned. Promptness, boldness, utter gladiatorianism, and a defiant humility should mark every syllable we breathe, and every line we trace. The preparative letter of Pierre to Glen plunged at once into the very heart of the matter, and was perhaps the briefest letter he had ever written him. Though by no means are such characteristics invariable exponents of the predominant mood or general disposition of a man, since so accidental a thing as a numb finger, or a bad quill, or poor ink, or squalid paper, or a rickety desk may produce all sorts of modifications. Yet in the present instance, the handwriting of Pierre happened plainly to attest and corroborate the spirit of his communication. The sheet was large, but the words were placarded upon it in heavy though rapid lines, only 6 or 8 to the page. And as the footman of a haughty visitor, some count or duke, announces the chariot of his lord by a thunderous knock on the portal, so to Glen did Pierre, in the broad, sweeping, and prodigious superscription of his letter, forewarn him what manner of man was on the road. In the moment of strong feeling a wonderful condensativeness points the tongue and pen, so that ideas, then enunciated sharp and quick as minute guns, in some other hour of unruffledness or unstimulatedness, require considerable time and trouble to verbally recall. Not here and now can we set down the precise contents of Pierre's letter, without a tautology illy doing justice to the ideas themselves. And though indeed the dread of tautology be the continual torment of some earnest minds, and, as such, is surely a weakness in them, and though no wise man will wonder at conscientious Virgil all eager at death to burn his Aeneid for a monstrous heap of inefficient superfluity, yet not to dread tautology at times only belongs to those enviable dunces, whom the partial God hath blessed over all the earth, with the inexhaustible self-riches of vanity, and folly, and a blind self-complacency. Some rumor of the discontinuance of his betrothment to Lucy Tartan, of his already consummated marriage with a poor and friendless orphan, of his mother's disowning him consequent upon these events. Such rumors, Pierre now wrote to his cousin, would very probably, in the parlors of his city relatives and acquaintances, precede his arrival in town. But he hinted no word of any possible commentary on these things. He simply went on to say that now, through the fortune of life, which was but the proverbially unreliable fortune of war, he was, for the present, thrown entirely upon his own resources, both for his own support and that of his wife, as well as for the temporary maintenance of a girl, whom he had lately had excellent reason for taking under his especial protection. He proposed a permanent residence in the city, not without some nearly quite settled plans as to the procuring of a competent income, without any ulterior reference to any member of their wealthy and widely ramified family. The house, whose temporary occupancy Glen had before so handsomely proffered him, would now be doubly and trebly desirable to him. But the pre-engaged servants, and the old china, and the old silver, and the old wines, and the mocha, were now become altogether unnecessary. Pierre would merely take the place, for a short interval, of the worthy old clerk, and, so far as Glen was concerned, simply stand guardian of the dwelling, till his plans were matured. His cousin had originally made his most bounteous overture, to welcome the coming of the presumed bride of Pierre, and though another lady had now taken her place at the altar, yet Pierre would still regard the offer of Glen as impersonal in that respect, and bearing equal reference to any young lady who should prove her claim to the possessed hand of Pierre. Since there was no universal law of opinion in such matters, Glen, on general worldly grounds, might not consider the real Mrs. Glendinning altogether so suitable a match for Pierre, as he possibly might have held numerous other young ladies in his eye. Nevertheless, Glen would find her ready to return with sincerity all his cousinly regard and attention. In conclusion, Pierre said that he and his party meditated an immediate departure, and would very probably arrive in town in 48 hours after the mailing of the present letter. He therefore begged Glen to see the more indispensable domestic appliances of the house set in some little order against their arrival, to have the rooms aired and lighted, and also forewarn the confidential clerk of what he might soon expect. Then, without any tapering sequel of, "Yours very truly and faithfully, my dear cousin Glen," he finished the letter with the abrupt and isolated signature of Pierre. Book 16, First Night of Their Arrival in the City, by Herman Melville. Chapter 1. The stage was belated. The country road they traveled entered the city by a remarkably wide and winding street, a great thoroughfare for its less opulent inhabitants. There was no moon and few stars. It was that preluding hour of the night when the shops are just closing, and the aspect of almost every wayfarer, as he passes through the unequal light reflected from the windows, speaks of one hurrying not abroad, but homeward. Though the thoroughfare was winding, yet no sweep that it made greatly obstructed its long and imposing vista, so that when the coach gained the top of the long and very gradual slope running toward the obscure heart of the town, and the twinkling perspective of two long and parallel rows of lamps was revealed, lamps which seemed not so much intended to dispel the general gloom, as to show some dim path leading through it, into some gloom still deeper beyond. When the coach gained this critical point, the whole vast triangular town, for a moment, seemed dimly and despondently to capitulate to the eye. And now, ere descending the gradually sloping declivity, and just on its summit as it were, the inmates of the coach, by numerous hard, painful joltings, and ponderous, dragging trundlings, are suddenly made sensible of some great change in the character of the road. The coach seems rolling over cannonballs of all calibers. Grasping Pierre's arm, Isabelle eagerly and forebodingly demands what is the cause of this most strange and unpleasant transition. The pavements, Isabelle. This is the town. Isabelle was silent, but, the first time for many weeks, Deli voluntarily spoke. It feels not so soft as the green sward, Master Pierre. No, Miss Ulver, said Pierre very bitterly. The buried hearts of some dead citizens have perhaps come to the surface. Sir, said Deli. And are they so hard-hearted here? Asked Isabelle. Ask yonder pavements, Isabelle. Milk dropped from the milkman's can in December freezes not more quickly on those stones than does snow-white innocence, if in poverty it chanced to fall in these streets. Then God help my hard fate, Master Pierre, sobbed Deli. Why didst thou drag hither a poor outcast like me? Forgive me, Miss Ulver, exclaimed Pierre with sudden warmth, and yet most marked respect. Forgive me. Never yet have I entered the city by night, but, somehow, it made me feel both bitter and sad. Come, be cheerful, we shall soon be comfortably housed, and have our comfort all to ourselves. The old clerk I spoke to you about is now doubtless ruefully eyeing his hat on the peg. Come, cheer up, Isabel. 'Tis a long ride, but here we are at last. Come, 'tis not very far now to our welcome. I hear a strange shuffling and clattering, said Deli with a shudder. It does not seem so light as just now, said Isabel. Yes, returned Pierre. It is the shop shutters being put on. It is the locking and bolting and barring of windows and doors. The townspeople are going to their rest. Please God they may find it, sighed Deli. They lock and bar out, then when they rest, do they, Pierre? Said Isabel. Yes, and you were thinking that does not bode well for the welcome I spoke of. Thou readst all my soul. Yes, I was thinking of that. But whither lead these long, narrow, dismal side glooms we pass every now and then? What are they? They seem terribly still. I see scarce any body in them. There's another, now. See how haggardly look its crisscross, far separate lamps. What are these side glooms, dear Pierre? Whither lead they? They are the thin tributaries, sweet Isabel, to the great Orinoco thoroughfare we are in. And like true tributaries, they come from the far hidden places, from under dark beetling secrecies of mortar and stone, through the long marsh grasses of villainy, and by many a transplanted bough beam, where the wretched have hung. I know nothing of these things, Pierre, but I like not the town. Think'st thou, Pierre, the time will ever come when all the earth shall be paved? Thank God! That never can be. These silent side glooms are horrible. Look, methinks, not for the world would I turn into one. That moment the nigh forewheel sharply grated under the body of the coach. Courage, cried Pierre. We are in it. Not so very solitary either. Here comes a traveler. Hark! What is that? Said Deli. That keen iron-ringing sound? It passed us just now. The keen traveler, said Pierre. He has steel plates to his boot heels. Some tender-souled elder son, I suppose. Pierre, said Isabel. This silence is unnatural, is fearful. The forests are never so still. Because brick and mortar have deeper secrets than wood or fell, sweet Isabel. But here we turn again. Now if I guess right, 2 more turns will bring us to the door. Courage, all will be well. Doubtless he has prepared a famous supper. Courage, Isabel. Come, shall it be tea or coffee? Some bread or crisp toast? We'll have eggs too, and some cold chicken perhaps. Then muttering to himself, I hope not that either. No cold collations. There's too much of that in these paving stones here. Set out for the famishing beggars to eat. No, I won't have the cold chicken. Then aloud, but here we turn again, yes, just as I thought. Ho, driver! Thrusting his head out of the window. To the right, to the right. Should be on the right. The first house with a light on the right. No lights yet but the streets, answered the surly voice of the driver. Stupid! He has passed it. Yes, yes, he has. Ho! Ho! Stop! Turn back. Have you not passed lighted windows? No lights but the streets, was the rough reply. What's the number? The number? Don't keep me beating about here all night. The number, I say. I do not know it, returned Pierre. But I well know the house. You must have passed it, I repeat. You must turn back. Surely you have passed lighted windows. Then them lights must burn black. There's no lighted windows in the street. I knows the city. Old maids lives here, and they are all to bed. Rest is warehouses. Will you stop the coach or not? Cried Pierre, now incensed at his surliness in continuing to drive on. I obeys orders. The first house with a light, and according to my reckoning, though to be sure, I don't know nothing of the city where I was born and bred all my life. No, I knows nothing at all about it. According to my reckoning, the first light in this here street will be the watch-house of the ward. Yes, there it is, all right. Cheap lodgings ye engaged. Nothing to pay, and victuals in. To certain temperaments, especially when previously agitated by any deep feeling, there is perhaps nothing more exasperating, and which sooner explodes all self-command, than the coarse, jeering insolence of a porter, cabman, or hack driver. Fetchers and carriers of the worst city infamy, as many of them are, professionally familiar with the most abandoned haunts, in the heart of misery, they drive one of the most mercenary of all the trades of guilt. Day-dozers and sluggards on their lazy boxes in the sunlight, and felinely wakeful and cat-eyed in the dark. Most habituated to midnight streets, only trod by sneaking burglars, wantons, and debauches, often in actual pandering league with the most abhorrent sinks, so that they are equally solicitous and suspectful that every customer they encounter in the dark will prove a profligate or a knave. This hideous tribe of ogres and Sharon ferrymen to corruption and death naturally slide into the most practically Calvinistical view of humanity, and hold every man at bottom a fit subject for the coarsest ribaldry and jest. Only fine coats and full pockets can whip such mangy hounds into decency. The least impatience, any quickness of temper, a sharp remonstrating word from a customer in a seedy coat, or betraying any other evidence of poverty, however minute and indirect, for in that pecuniary respect they are the most piercing and infallible of all the judgers of men, will be almost sure to provoke, in such cases, their least endurable disdain. Perhaps it was the unconscious transfer to the stage driver of some such ideas as these, which now prompted the highly irritated Pierre to an act, which, in a more benignant hour, his better reason would have restrained him from. He did not see the light to which the driver had referred, and was heedless, in his sudden wrath, that the coach was now going slower in approaching it. Ere Isabel could prevent him, he burst open the door, and leaping to the pavement, sprang ahead of the horses, and violently reined back the leaders by their heads. The driver seized his four-in-hand whip, and with a volley of oaths was about striking out its long, coiling lash at Pierre, when his arm was arrested by a policeman, who suddenly leaping on the staid coach, commanded him to keep the peace. "Speak! What is the difficulty here? Be quiet, ladies, nothing serious has happened. Speak you! Pierre! Pierre!" cried the alarmed Isabel. In an instant Pierre was at her side by the window, and now turning to the officer, explained to him that the driver had persisted in passing the house at which he was ordered to stop. "Then he shall turn to the right about with you, sir. In double quick time too. Do ye hear? I know you rascals well enough. Turn about, you sir, and take the gentleman where he directed." The cow driver was beginning a long string of criminating explanations, when turning to Pierre, the policeman calmly desired him to re-enter the coach. He would see him safely at his destination, and then seating himself beside the driver on the box, commanded him to tell the number given him by the gentleman. "He don't know no numbers. Didn't I say he didn't? That's what I got mad about." "Be still," said the officer. "Sir," turning round and addressing Pierre within, "where do you wish to go?" "I do not know the number, but it is a house in this street. We have passed it. It is, I think, the fourth or fifth house this side of the last corner we turned. It must be lighted up too. It is the small old-fashioned dwelling with stone lion heads above the windows. But make him turn round and drive slowly, and I will soon point it out." "Can't see lions in the dark," growled the driver. "Lions, ha! Ha! Jackasses more likely." "Look you," said the officer, "I shall see you tightly housed this night, my fine fellow, if you don't cease your jabber. Sir," he added, resuming with Pierre, "I am sure there is some mistake here. I perfectly well know now the house you mean. I passed it within the last half-hour. All as quiet there as ever. No one lives there, I think. I never saw a light in it. Are you not mistaken in something?" Then Pierre paused in perplexity and foreboding. Was it possible that Glenn had willfully and utterly neglected his letter? Not possible. But it might not have come to his hand. The mails sometimes delayed. Then again, it was not wholly out of the question that the house was prepared for them after all, even though it showed no outward sign. But that was not probable. At any rate, as the driver protested, that his 4 horses and lumbering vehicle could not turn short round in that street, and that if he must go back, it could only be done by driving on and going round the block and so retracing his road, and as after such a procedure on his part, then in case of a confirmed disappointment respecting the house, the driver would seem warranted, at least in some of his unmanliness, and as Pierre loathed the villain altogether, therefore, in order to run no such risks, he came to a sudden determination on the spot. "I owe you very much, my good friend," said he to the officer, "for your timely assistance. To be frank, what you have just told me has indeed perplexed me not a little concerning the place where I propose to stop. Is there no hotel in this neighborhood where I could leave these ladies while I seek my friend, wanted to all manner of deceitfulness, and engaged in a calling which unavoidably makes one distrustful of mere appearances, however specious, however honest?" The really good-hearted officer now eyed Pierre in the dubious light with a most unpleasant scrutiny, and he abandoned the "sir," and the tone of his voice sensibly changed as he replied, "There is no hotel in this neighborhood. It is too off the thoroughfares." "Come, come," cried the driver, now growing bold again. "Though you're an officer, I'm a citizen for all that. You haven't any further right to keep me out of my bed now. He don't know where he wants to go to, 'cause he hain't got no place at all to go to. So I'll just dump him here and you daren't stay me." "Don't be impertinent now," said the officer, but not so sternly as before. "I'll have my rights, though, I tell you that. Leave go of my arm. Damn ye, get off the box. I've the law now. I say, mister, come tramp, here goes your luggage." And so saying, he dragged toward him a light trunk on the top of the stage. "Keep a clean tongue in ye now," said the officer, "and don't be in quite so great a hurry." Then addressing Pierre, who had now realighted from the coach, "Well, this can't continue. What do you intend to do?" "Not to ride further with that man at any rate," said Pierre. "I will stop right here for the present." He, laughed the driver. He, 'mazing accommodating now, we hitches now, we do. Stops right afore the watch house, he. That's funny. Off with the luggage then, driver," said the policeman. "Here hand the small trunk, and now away and unlash there behind." During all this scene, Deli had remained perfectly silent in her trembling and rustic alarm, while Isabel, by occasional cries to Pierre, had vainly besought some explanation. But though their complete ignorance of city life had caused Pierre's two companions to regard the scene thus far with too much trepidation, yet now, when in the obscurity of night, and in the heart of a strange town, Pierre handed them out of the coach into the naked street, and they saw their luggage piled so near the white light of a watch-house, the same ignorance, in some sort, reversed its effects on them, for they little fancied in what really untoward and wretched circumstances they first touched the flagging of the city. As the coach lumbered off, and went rolling into the wide murkiness beyond, Pierre spoke to the officer. "It is a rather strange accident, I confess, my friend, but strange accidents will sometimes happen." "In the best of families," rejoined the other a little ironically. "Now, I must not quarrel with this man," thought Pierre to himself, stung at the officer's tone. Then said, "Is there anyone in your office?" "No one as yet, not late enough." "Will you have the kindness, then, to house these ladies there for the present, while I make haste to provide them with better lodgment?" "Let on, if you please." The man seemed to hesitate a moment, but finally acquiesced, and soon they passed under the white light, and entered a large, plain, and most forbidding-looking room, with hacked wooden benches and bunks ranged along the sides, and a railing before a desk in one corner. The permanent keeper of the place was quietly reading a paper by the long central double bat-swing gaslight, and 3 officers off duty were nodding on a bench. "Not very liberal accommodations," said the officer quietly. "Nor always the best of company, but we try to be civil. Be seated, ladies," politely drawing a small bench toward them. "Hello, my friends," said Pierre, approaching the nodding 3 beyond, and tapping them on the shoulder. "Hello, I say. Will you do me a little favor? Will you help bring some trunks in from the street? I will satisfy you for your trouble, and be much obliged into the bargain." Instantly the 3 nodders, used to sudden awakenings, opened their eyes and stared hard, and being further enlightened by the bat-swings and first officer, promptly brought in the luggage as desired. Pierre hurriedly sat down by Isabel, and in a few words gave her to understand that she was now in a perfectly secure place, however unwelcoming, that the officers would take every care of her, while he made all possible speed in running to the house and indubitably ascertaining how matters stood there. He hoped to be back in less than 10 minutes with good tidings. Explaining his intention to the first officer, and begging him not to leave the girls till he should return, he forthwith sallied into the street. He quickly came to the house, and immediately identified it. But all was profoundly silent and dark. He rang the bell, but no answer, and waiting long enough to be certain that either the house was indeed deserted, or else the old clerk was unawakeable or absent, and at all events certain that no slightest preparation had been made for their arrival, Pierre, bitterly disappointed, returned to Isabelle with this most unpleasant information. Nevertheless, something must be done, and quickly. Turning to one of the officers, he begged him to go and seek a hack, that the whole party might be taken to some respectable lodging. But the man, as well as his comrades, declined the errand on the score that there was no stand on their beat, and they could not, on any account, leave their beat. So Pierre himself must go. He by no means liked to leave Isabelle and Dely again, on an expedition which might occupy some time. But there seemed no resource, and time now imperiously pressed. Communicating his intention therefore to Isabelle, and again entreating the officer's particular services as before, and promising not to leave him unrequited, Pierre again sallied out. He looked up and down the street and listened, but no sound of any approaching vehicle was audible. He ran on, and turning the first corner, bent his rapid steps toward the greatest and most central avenue of the city, assured that there, if anywhere, he would find what he wanted. It was some distance off, and he was not without hope that an empty hack would meet him ere he arrived there. But the few stray ones he encountered had all muffled fares. He continued on, and at last gained the great avenue. Not habitually used to such scenes, Pierre for a moment was surprised that the instant he turned out of the narrow and dark and death-like by-street, he should find himself suddenly precipitated into the not yet repressed noise and contention, and all the garish night-life of a vast thoroughfare, crowded and wedged by day, and even now, at this late hour, brilliant with occasional illuminations, and echoing to very many swift wheels and footfalls. Chapter 2. I say, my pretty one, dear, young man. Oh, love, you are in a vast hurry, ain't you? Can't you stop a bit now, my dear? Do. There's a sweet fellow. Pierre turned, and in the flashing, sinister, evil crosslights of a druggist's window, his eye caught the person of a wonderfully beautifully featured girl, scarlet-cheeked, glaringly arrayed, and of a figure all natural grace but unnatural vivacity. Her whole form, however, was horribly lit by the green and yellow rays from the druggist's. My God! Shuddered Pierre, hurrying forward. The town's first welcome to youth! He was just crossing over to where a line of hacks were drawn up against the opposite curb, when his eye was arrested by a short, gilded name, rather reservedly and aristocratically denominating a large and very handsome house, the second story of which was profusely lighted. He looked up, and was very certain that in this house were the apartments of Glen. Yielding to a sudden impulse, he mounted the single step toward the door, and rang the bell, which was quickly responded to by a very civil black. As the door opened, he heard the distant interior sound of dancing music and merriment. Is Mr. Stanley in? Mr. Stanley? Yes, but he's engaged. How? He is somewhere in the drawing rooms. My mistress is giving a party to the lodgers. I? Tell Mr. Stanley I wish to see him for 1 moment, if you please. Only 1 moment. I dare not call him, sir. He said that possibly someone might call for him tonight. They are calling every night for Mr. Stanley, but I must admit no one on the plea of the party. A dark and bitter suspicion now darted through the mind of Pierre, and ungovernably yielding to it, and resolved to prove or falsify it without delay, he said to the black, My business is pressing. I must see Mr. Stanley. I am sorry, sir, but orders are orders. I am his particular servant here, the one that sees his silver every holy day. I can't disobey him. May I shut the door, sir? For as it is, I cannot admit you. The drawing rooms are on the 2nd floor, are they not? Said Pierre quietly. Yes, said the black, pausing in surprise and holding the door. Yonder are the stairs, I think? That way, sir, but this is yours. and the now suspicious black was just on the point of closing the portal violently upon him, when Pierre thrust him suddenly aside, and springing up the long stairs, found himself facing an open door, from whence proceeded a burst of combined brilliancy and melody, doubly confusing to one just emerged from the street. But bewildered and all demented as he momentarily felt, he instantly stalked in, and confounded the amazed company with his unremoved slouched hat, pale cheek, and whole dusty, travel-stained, and ferocious aspect. "Mr. Stanley! Where is Mr. Stanley?" he cried, advancing straight through a startled quadrille, while all the music suddenly hushed, and every eye was fixed in vague affright upon him. "Mr. Stanley! Mr. Stanley!" cried several bladish voices, toward the further end of the further drawing-room, into which the first one widely opened. "Here is a most peculiar fellow after you. Who the devil is he?" "I think I see him," replied a singularly cool, deliberate, and rather drawling voice, yet a very silvery one, and at bottom perhaps a very resolute one. "I think I see him. Stand aside, my good fellow, will you? Ladies, remove from between me and yonder hat." The polite compliance of the company thus addressed now revealed to the advancing Pierre the tall, robust figure of a remarkably splendid-looking and brown-bearded young man, dressed with surprising plainness, almost demureness, for such an occasion. But this plainness of his dress was not so obvious at first, the material was so fine and admirably fitted. He was carelessly lounging in a half-sidelong attitude upon a large sofa, and appeared as if but just interrupted in some very agreeable chat with a diminutive but vivacious brunette, occupying the other end. The dandy and the man, strength and effeminacy, courage and indolence, were so strangely blended in this superb-eyed youth, that at first sight it seemed impossible to decide whether there was any genuine metal in him or not. Some years had gone by since the cousins had met, years peculiarly productive of the greatest conceivable changes in the general personal aspect of human beings. Nevertheless, the eye seldom alters. The instant their eyes met, they mutually recognized each other. But both did not betray the recognition. "Glenn!" cried Pierre, and paused a few steps from him. But the superb-eyed only settled himself lower down in his lounging attitude, and slowly withdrawing a small, unpretending, and unribboned glass from his vest pocket, steadily, yet not entirely insultingly, notwithstanding the circumstances, scrutinized Pierre. Then, dropping his glass, turned slowly round upon the gentleman near him, saying in the same peculiar, mixed and musical voice as before, "I do not know him, it is an entire mistake. Why don't the servants take him out and the music go on? As I was saying, Miss Clara, the statues you saw in the Louvre are not to be mentioned with those in Florence and Rome. Why, there now is that vaunted chef d'oeuvre, the fighting gladiator of the Louvre." "Fighting gladiator it is?" yelled Pierre, leaping toward him like Spartacus. But the savage impulse in him was restrained by the alarmed female shrieks and wild gestures around him. As he paused, several gentlemen made motions to pinion him. But shaking them off fiercely, he stood erect and isolated for an instant, and fastening his glance upon his still reclining and apparently unmoved cousin, thus spoke. "Glendinning Stanley, thou disown'st Pierre not so abhorrently as Pierre does thee. By heaven, had I a knife, Glen, I could prick thee on the spot. Let out all thy Glendinning blood, and then sew up the vile remainder. Hound, and base blot upon the general humanity. This is very extraordinary. Remarkable case of combined imposture and insanity. But where are the servants? Why don't that black advance? Let him out, my good doc. Lead him out. Carefully, carefully. Stay," putting his hand in his pocket. "There, take that, and have the poor fellow driven off somewhere." Bolting his rage in him, as impossible to be sated by any conduct, in such a place, Pierre now turned, sprang down the stairs, and fled the house. Chapter 3. "Hack, sir? Hack, sir? Hack, sir? Cab, sir? Cab, sir? Cab, sir? This way, sir. This way, sir. This way, sir. He's a rogue. Not him. He's a rogue." Pierre was surrounded by a crowd of contending hackmen, all holding long whips in their hands, while others eagerly beckoned to him from their boxes, where they sat elevated between their two coach lamps like shabby, discarded saints. The whipstocks thickened around him, and several reports of the cracking lashes sharply sounded in his ears. Just bursting from a scene so goading as his interview with the scornful Glenn in the dazzling drawing-room, to Pierre, this sudden tumultuous surrounding of him by whipstocks and lashes seemed like the onset of the chastising fiends upon Orestes. But, breaking away from them, he seized the first plated door handle near him, and, leaping into the hack, shouted for whoever was the keeper of it, to mount his box forthwith and drive off in a given direction. The vehicle had proceeded some way down the great avenue when it paused, and the driver demanded whither now. What place? The watch-house of the ward, cried Pierre. Hi! Hi! Going to deliver himself up, hey! Grinned the fellow to himself. Well, that's a sort of honest anyway. Geelang, you dogs? Whist! Wah! Geelang! The sights and sounds which met the eye of Pierre on re-entering the watch-house filled him with inexpressible horror and fury. The before decent, drowsy place now fairly reeked with all things unseemly. Hardly possible was it to tell what conceivable cause or occasion had, in the comparatively short absence of Pierre, collected such a base congregation. In indescribable disorder, frantic, diseased-looking men and women of all colors, and in all imaginable flaunting, immodest, grotesque, and shattered dresses, were leaping, yelling, and cursing around him. The torn madras handkerchiefs of negresses, and the red gowns of yellow girls, hanging in tatters from their naked bosoms, mixed with the rent dresses of deep-rouged white women, and the split coats, checkered vests, and protruding shirts of pale or whiskered or haggard or mustached fellows of all nations, some of whom seemed scared from their beds, and others seemingly arrested in the midst of some crazy and wanton dance. On all sides were heard drunken male and female voices, in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, interlarded now and then, with the foulest of all human lingos, that dialect of sin and death, known as the cant language or the flash. Running among this combined babel of persons and voices, several of the police were vainly striving to still the tumult, while others were busy handcuffing the more desperate. And here and there the distracted wretches, both men and women, gave downright battle to the officers, and still others already handcuffed struck out at them with their joined ironed arms. Meanwhile, words and phrases unrepeatable in God's sunlight, and whose very existence was utterly unknown, and undreamed of by tens of thousands of the decent people of the city. Syllables obscene and accursed were shouted forth in tones plainly evincing that they were the common household breath of their utterers. The thieves' quarters and all the brothels, lock and sin hospitals for incurables, and infirmaries and infernos of hell seemed to have made one combined sortie, and poured out upon earth through the vile vomitory of some unmentionable cellar. Though the hitherto imperfect and casual city experiences of Pierre illy fitted him entirely to comprehend the specific purport of this terrific spectacle, still he knew enough by hearsay of the more infamous life of the town, to imagine from whence and who were the objects before him. But all his consciousness at the time was absorbed by the one horrified thought of Isabel and Delhi, forced to witness a sight hardly endurable for Pierre himself, or, possibly, sucked into the tumult, and in close personal contact with its loathsomeness. Rushing into the crowd, regardless of the random blows and curses he encountered, he wildly sought for Isabel, and soon descried her struggling from the delirious reaching arms of a half-clad reeling whiskerando. With an immense blow of his mailed fist, he sent the wretch humming, and seizing Isabel, cried out to two officers near, to clear a path for him to the door. They did so, and in a few minutes the panting Isabel was safe in the open air. He would have stayed by her, but she conjured him to return for Delhi, exposed to worse insults than herself. An additional posse of officers now approaching, Pierre committing her to the care of one of them, and summoning two others to join himself, now re-entered the room. In another quarter of it, he saw Delhi seized on each hand by two bleared and half-bloody women, who with fiendish grimaces were ironically twitting her upon her close-neck dress, and had already stripped her handkerchief from her. She uttered a cry of mixed anguish and joy at the sight of him, and Pierre soon succeeded in returning with her to Isabel. During the absence of Pierre in quest of the hack, and while Isabel and Delhi were quietly awaiting his return, the door had suddenly burst open, and a detachment of the police drove in, and caged, the entire miscellaneous night occupants of a notorious stew, which they had stormed and carried during the height of some outrageous orgy. The first sight of the interior of the watchhouse, and their being so quickly huddled together within its 4 blank walls, had suddenly lashed the mob into frenzy. So that for the time, oblivious of all other considerations, the entire force of the police was directed to the quelling of the indoor riot. And consequently, abandoned to their own protection, Isabel and Delhi had been temporarily left to its mercy. It was no time for Pierre to manifest his indignation at the officer, even if he could now find him, who had thus falsified his individual pledge concerning the precious charge committed to him. Nor was it any time to distress himself about his luggage, still somewhere within. Quitting all, he thrust the bewildered and half-lifeless girls into the waiting hack, which, by his orders, drove back in the direction of the stand, where Pierre had first taken it up. When the coach had rolled them well away from the tumult, Pierre stopped it and said to the man that he desired to be taken to the nearest respectable hotel or boarding house of any kind that he knew of. The fellow, maliciously diverted by what had happened thus far, made some ambiguous and rudely merry rejoinder. But warned by his previous rash quarrel with the stage driver, Pierre passed this unnoticed, and in a controlled, calm, decided manner repeated his directions. The issue was that after a rather roundabout drive they drew up in a very respectable side street, before a large respectable-looking house, illuminated by 2 tall white lights flanking its portico. Pierre was glad to notice some little remaining stir within, spite of the comparative lateness of the hour. A bareheaded, tidily dressed, and very intelligent-looking man, with a broom clothes-brush in his hand, appearing, scrutinized him rather sharply at first. But as Pierre advanced further into the light, and his countenance became visible, the man, assuming a respectful but still slightly perplexed air, invited the whole party into a closely adjoining parlor, whose disordered chairs and general dustiness evinced that, after a day's activity, it now awaited the morning offices of the housemaids. "Baggage, sir? I have left my baggage at another place," said Pierre. "I shall send for it tomorrow." "Ah!" exclaimed the very intelligent-looking man, rather dubiously. "Shall I discharge the hack, then?" "Stay," said Pierre, bethinking him that it would be well not to let the man know from whence they had last come. "I will discharge it myself, thank you." So returning to the sidewalk without debate, he paid the hackman an exorbitant fare, who, anxious to secure such illegal gains beyond all hope of recovery, quickly mounted his box and drove off at a gallop. "Will you step into the office, sir, now?" said the man, slightly flourishing with his brush. "This way, sir, if you please." Pierre followed him, into an almost deserted, dimly lit room with a stand in it. Going behind the stand, the man turned round to him a large ledger-like book, thickly inscribed with names, like any directory, and offered him a pen ready dipped in ink. Understanding the general hint, though secretly irritated at something in the manner of the man, Pierre drew the book to him, and wrote in a firm hand, at the bottom of the last-named column, "Mr. and Mrs. Pierre Glendinning, and Miss Ulver." The man glanced at the writing inquiringly, and then said, "The other column, sir, where from?" "True," said Pierre, and wrote Saddle Meadows. The very intelligent-looking man re-examined the page, and then slowly stroking his shaven chin, with a fork, made of his thumb for one tine, and his united 4 fingers for the other, said softly and whisperingly, "Anywheres in this country, sir?" "Yes, in the country," said Pierre, evasively, and bridling his ire. "But now show me to 2 chambers, will you? The one for myself and wife, I desire to have opening into another. A 3rd one, never mind how small, but I must have a dressing-room." "Dressing room," repeated the man in an ironically deliberative voice. "Dressing room, hem! You will have your luggage taken into the dressing-room, then, I suppose. Oh, I forgot, your luggage ain't come yet. Ah, yes, yes, yes. Luggage is coming tomorrow. Oh, yes, yes, certainly, tomorrow, of course. By the way, sir, I dislike to seem at all uncivil, and I am sure you will not deem me so. But, well," said Pierre, mustering all his self-command for the coming impertinence, "when stranger gentlemen come to this house without luggage, we think ourselves bound to ask them to pay their bills in advance, sir. That is all, sir." "I shall stay here tonight and the whole of tomorrow at any rate," rejoined Pierre, thankful that this was all. "How much will it be?" And he drew out his purse. The man's eyes fastened with eagerness on the purse. He looked from it to the face of him who held it, then seemed half-hesitating an instant, then brightening up said with sudden suavity, never mind, sir, though rogues sometimes be gentlemanly. Gentlemen that are gentlemen never go abroad without their diplomas. Their diplomas are their friends, and their only friends are their dollars. You have a purse full of friends. We have chambers, sir, that will exactly suit you, I think. Bring your ladies, and I will show you up to them immediately. So saying, dropping his brush, the very intelligent-looking man lighted one lamp, and taking 2 unlighted ones in his other hand, led the way down the dusky lead-sheeted hall, Pierre following him with Isabelle and Deli. Dear listener, we close the pages on another tale, a journey through words, imagination, and emotion. Here at the Falls Audiobook, where stories flow like a river's current, carrying you to distant worlds and uncharted depths. We thank you for joining us. As always, we invite you to linger a little longer. Subscribe to our channel to discover more stories waiting to be heard, each a cascade of voices, ideas, and artistry. And remember, every great story begins with a single word. Perhaps the next one will begin with you. Until our voices meet again, may your days be filled with quiet moments, rich pages, and the soothing sound of a story well told. This is the Falls Audiobook, signing off.